My name is Louis Adkins. I'm with Roetzel and Andress, and it is my great pleasure to start the luncheon part of the program by introducing our featured speaker here this afternoon, at least for lunch. And we are so lucky to have him, Jay Williams, who is here to talk a little bit about the administration's perspective on transportation. And let me, by way of background, give some introductions with regard to him, who I've known for a number of years, and he's a fabulous guy, former mayor, and so he gets it both from the top level and from the ground level, and that, I think, is a special treat for us. Jay currently serves in the administration of President Barack Obama as Executive Director of the U.S. Office of Recovery for Auto Communities and Workers at the U.S. Department of Labor. He has also served as the White House Director of Intergovernmental Affairs. Jay works around the country on behalf of the President to engage mayors, local elected officials, and other stakeholders on issues of economic, community, and workforce development. In September of 2013, President Barack Obama nominated Jay to lead the Economic Development Administration. The nomination to serve as Assistant Director of the U.S. Department of Commerce for Economic Development is pending confirmation by the U.S. Senate, and I just was informed by Jay that everything seems to be headed in the right direction. Right, Jay? Right. The EDA leads the federal economic development agenda by promoting innovative, collaborative opportunities and helping communities build the foundation for long-term growth. Prior to joining the Obama administration, Williams served as mayor for Youngstown, Ohio. In spite of all his travel, he's still a Buckeye. He holds the distinction of being the city's first African-American and youngest mayor of Youngstown. Mayor Williams is a recipient of the 2007 John F. Kennedy New Frontier Award. The John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, in conjunction with the Harvard University Institute of Politics, annually recognizes two exceptional young Americans under the age of 40 whose contributions in elected office, community service, or advocacy demonstrates the impact and value of public service in the spirit of John F. Kennedy. Williams was also named one of the governing magazine's public officials for 2008. Prior to being elected, Jay spent 5 years as the Director of Community Development for the city. Before transitioning into public service, Jay was Vice President of First Place Bank in Warren, Ohio. His banking career included time at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland as a commercial bank examiner. Jay is a proud graduate of Youngstown State with a BS in finance. He is also the proud father of a young child, and his wife is absolutely as delightful as he is. So please give me a loud welcome for Jay, and we certainly welcome his comments this afternoon.
Thanks, Lou, for the introduction, and thank you to Commissioner Portune and to Mayor Cranley for convening this session. Let me start off by saying that I am exceptionally encouraged and indeed inspired by the level of continuity that has been present in the speakers, in the presenters, in the presentations leading up to this, and even to the extent that it is going to be redundant in some of the comments that I make, but that's a good thing, because anytime you have a group like this convene and you hear the continuity between and amongst the presentations, and certainly some of the things that I'll talk about very briefly are some of the things you've already heard, but hopefully what that does, it serves to validate and underscore the importance of what's going on here and the fact that we are very much in this region on the same page. So what is my role here? What I hope to do is provide some perspective from the administration as it relates to transportation and infrastructure in general. And certainly I know we're focusing specifically on transit and rail integration, but you can't talk about that without also talking about its importance to economic and community development. So that's what I hope to provide, a vantage point from the administration's viewpoint. And I've had the opportunity to work with local stakeholders, both elected officials and other stakeholders across the country on issues of community and economic development, which very much often include transportation and specifically rail integration. So there's an inextricable or inarguable link between the U.S. economy, transit, and jobs. And the president has made it very clear in terms of strengthening the economy. And let me confess that I spent way too much time on this slide. For those of you who are engineers, the gears aren't moving in the perspective that actual gears would move, and that drove me crazy. And I'm a frustrated engineer at heart, so it was one of those things where I probably spent way too much time, and that's why we use AutoCAD to do our engineering and not PowerPoint, but you get the point. There's a link between the U.S. economy, transit, and jobs. This was a stat that was quoted earlier today, but was also important because the president talked about it in the State of the Union. And I guess I should go back on the first slide. You saw the words opportunity, action, and optimism. Opportunity, action, and optimism were the framework that the president presented the State of the Union through, and it's the same thing I think is exceptionally relevant for what we're talking about here today. So the infrastructure, as has been rated in this country, slows down the economy to the extent of costing us over $100 billion annually. 42% of the major urban highways being congested. And again, we're talking about rail, but when we're talking about transportation, all of these things in a multimodal environment are important. So there's also a link, as we talked about, between the economy. And the economy is picking up speed. And there was a recent study done by the Boston Consulting Group that in February 2012, the large manufacturers who were surveyed, 37% of them were considering insourcing jobs back to the United States of America. In September of 2013, that had risen to 54% of large manufacturers were considering moving manufacturing back on the U.S. shores. And in today's global economy, first-class jobs gravitate toward first-class infrastructure. So to talk about in a broad sense what the president is doing and what's happening in Washington, D.C., he talked about continuing to work with Congress because, as we all know, there are some things that absolutely require a legislative fix. One of the proposals that's been talked about and does have some bipartisan support, although it's not gained enough traction, is helping to pay for infrastructure investments by reforming business taxes and closing loopholes. Understanding, it was talked about just prior to us breaking for lunch, that this is not going to be a permanent fix. This will be something that will provide will potentially provide an infusion, but ultimately we do have to have a discussion in this country about the method and the manner in which we're going to fund transportation overall. But some of the things that are being debated and talked about in Washington. Another interesting point, that this president is very much supportive of efforts to attract and facilitate private investment in infrastructure. And I thought that was key because earlier Commissioner Portune talked about the RIZs, the Regional Infrastructure Investment Zones, or the improvement zones. One mechanism that is being talked about in this region that would facilitate that private investment into public infrastructure. You also have not only the potential of corporations investing, but pension funds and other large investment entities who, if given the right environment and given the right set of tools, would be very much interested in making that investment. So there is where you have an opportunity to enhance the funding mechanisms or the funding streams that are associated with improving our infrastructure. So while he will continue to work with Congress, the president has made it also very clear that he is not going to wait for Congress, that when appropriate and where appropriate, he very much has been and will continue to take executive actions. And some of the things which may seem not necessarily earth-shattering, but very necessary when it comes to these types of projects, and you all know that as practitioners. Making more timely decisions on federal permits and reviews, directing federal agencies to adopt and institutionalize more industry-recognized best practices, and I'll talk specifically about how that is helping in just a minute. And since the executive order went out in 2011, there have already been, now these numbers need to be updated, over 52 major projects, which includes bridges, railways, ports, waterways, airports, renewable energy projects that have been expedited as a result of the president taking those executive actions. Secretary Anthony Foxx, again, who is the epitome of an individual who, as mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, had transportation, a very progressive transportation agenda, and also understands the local perspective, who is now obviously serving as the Secretary of the Transportation Department. He laid out about a month or two ago his vision for the U.S. Department of Transportation. And he laid out 6 areas in which he wanted to focus on throughout his tenure. And the first one being the infrastructure deficit. Again, we know this data, that we've got $86 billion according to the American Society of Civil Engineers in backlog maintenance. 1/3 of the major roads being in poor or mediocre condition. We certainly don't have to talk about bridges with respect to over 100,000 bridges in this country being over 60 years old. And certainly the bridge here that the president has visited being on that list. Obviously, the need for funding, and we referenced the fact that we are not going to be, or the Secretary referenced the fact that we are not going to be able to simply spend our way out of this. The necessity of a long-term surface transportation bill, and let me add that he also made it clear, a long-term bill for rail. Understanding the enhancements with the corporate tax reform that we talked about, and there is some discussion and some progress, bipartisan progress, on Capitol Hill, both Democrats and Republicans trying to come together to figure out, if not a ultimate solution, at least a solution that provides us a more long-term steps in terms of funding. Because you all know that when you have these short-term funding bills, like we have in MAP 21, glad that MAP 21 got passed, but MAP 21 expires in the fall of this year. So when you have that level of unpredictability in terms of funding sources and not knowing exactly how the funding is going to flow or when the funding is going to flow, it makes projects at the local and state level that much more difficult. So there are efforts underway, and there's a recognition that the long-term funding needs to be a part of the solution that will ultimately help you. And again, it doesn't make the local projects easy, but at least it takes that unpredictability or that uncertainty off of the table. Talking about, again, efficiency, not simply being able to spend our way out. And there was some best practices that might seem commonplace, but that unfortunately haven't historically been used in some of the federal transportation projects. And I gave the example of 1 + 1, how can we make that equal 3? And there was a road project in Utah that serves as a good example. And again, it's a road project, but the principle is applicable to whether it's rail or other transportation projects. And it was as simple as having the project designers and the builders of the road work together on site. And that is something that hasn't traditionally been done before. And as a result of that change, it was initiated by the Department of Transportation. The I-15 project was finished 2 full years ahead of schedule and saved $260 million. And that is virtually unheard of, to have a project of that scope come in 2 years ahead of schedule and save $260 million. Well, that $260 million was put back into the pipeline and was able to fund 3 additional projects as a result of a somewhat straightforward and simple change of having the designers and the builders on site working together. So there are going to be steps like that that are going to have to be taken because, again, the reality in which we exist economically is there isn't going to be a huge inflow of new money anytime soon. So to the extent that we can implement best practices, to the extent that we can use steps like this to make the funding more efficient, is our approaches that the Secretary of Transportation is very much pushing during his term. Creating a national vision of transportation, and that is something that was very evident through the discussions this morning that is already underway in the OKI region. This fractured view of transportation that has so often been a detriment, where rail people like rail and bus people like buses, and the highway designers like more efficient and wider highways. And all of those are very important in terms of a multimodal transportation, But to the extent that we can start beginning to look at those on a collaborative basis, very much like was described here, creating that culture, and it was Richard Van Brusker who talked about the myth of us being too much of a car culture to embrace some of these multimodal transportation initiatives. And I've seen that firsthand as my wife and I remember when Richard talked about being 16 and getting his license, and one of the biggest disappointments that I had as a teenager was the fact that I turned 16 on a Saturday, and I couldn't go get my driver's permit right then. And one of the biggest excitements that I had is a few years later when I got a job in Cleveland. I said, I'm going to commute. I get to be a commuter and drive to Cleveland from Youngstown, Ohio. And after a couple of dozen times and that newness wore off, I started longing for train service. And the thing that I noticed was also that there were the same cars. When we drove from Cleveland and ended up from Youngstown to the Mahoning Valley, ended up parking, I saw the same cars day after day after day with the license plates from Mahoning and Trumbull County. So there were dozens and dozens and dozens of individuals. So even then, as a young person, it gave me an appreciation or a longing for a better solution. It's also something that I saw when we transitioned from Ohio to Washington, D.C. One of the things that is very positive about living there is the fact that there is a well-established metro system in terms of integrated multimodal transportation. And I've seen that time and time again, and one of my prized possessions is my, thought I had it with me, my Metro card. I hope I didn't lose it. And I say that because, oh, here it is. So when Richard talked about his 17-year-old son and how it warmed his heart as a transportation planner that his son really has no interest in getting his license, I have the same story, and let me, in a very lighthearted way, one-up him. So my wife and I, our son Ethan is 3 years old, and he is absolutely, and I'm sure most 3-year-olds are obsessed by trains and buses and things, but the thing that he is most interested in, and the thing that he almost insists, as we make our way back and forth between Youngstown and where we still have family and consider our home in D.C., that he will very often insist as we get closer to the D.C. area that we stop, get off of the freeway, and I am basically required to get off and find a train station. So my wife and my mother will drive the rest of the way home, and Ethan and I will have to take a train. At 3 years old, I mean, he has this concept that it's either that or hear him wail all the way in. So again, it goes to this generation, and although I'm no longer in the 26 to 40-year-old demographic, at least not literally in my mind I may be, it does say that there is an opportunity to capture the imagination and the hearts and minds of individuals who will look at it differently. So, as we came up, or some of us came up during the expansion of the interstate highways, and we saw both the benefits initially and then some of the drawbacks there is a generation that is going to be perhaps more willing to make those difficult decisions, both politically and economically, that ultimately result in us having a more integrated transportation system on a national scale. But from what has been discussed here this morning, it is already evident that that thinking and that mindset is very much present here in the OKI region. And safety, the Secretary Fox made it very clear that, and that those stats were also talked about, that there's never been a more safe travel on rail than there has been today and moving forward. And that continues to be a priority, not just in rail, but travel overall, but certainly with respect to moving both freight and passengers. The other thing that was talked about, and I won't spend a lot of time on here because this was information that was provided by the FTA to the folks here, the officials here, when there was some questions or concerns about figuring out funding strategies for the integration and operation of light rail. So now that at least that decision, that go decision has been made, not that there aren't hurdles or questions that still need to be answered, but it doesn't require us spending a lot of time on that particular issue. So as I said from the beginning, when you talk about transportation, you talk about its impact on the economy. When you talk about transportation, you also talk about its impact on community and economic development. They are absolutely inseparable. And where transportation, community development, and economic development really converge is where we're finding ourselves trying to create that quality of life that was talked about any HDR studies. And again, I didn't participate in those studies, but I found them absolutely true and accurate from my own perspective and from the perspective you see of trying to create a quality of life in the communities in our respective regions. So one of the things that I would hope to at least open perspective on is, as we talk about transportation and economic development being intertwined, DOT is absolutely the foremost entity from the federal standpoint of overseeing and providing the funding for transportation. But I would encourage you to be mindful of other federal agencies that, while not specifically focused on transportation, are focused on economic development. And because the two are inextricably linked, there perhaps are other opportunities in other agencies to find funding and resources, both actual funding and technical resources, that could assist in helping to address some of the transportation issues. As Louis talked about, I was nominated by the President in September to head up the Economic Development Agency, which is a part of the Department of Commerce. And while not confirmed yet, I'm pleased to have bipartisan support for that nomination, which is pending before the U.S. Senate. And EDA is a unique agency. It is the only federal agency with a mission solely devoted to economic development. Well, again, it's not devoted to transportation as DOT is, but it is solely focused on economic development. And as we talked about, it's really difficult to uncouple the two when you talk about in the context of what we're trying to do here in this region and regions across the country. It's a core part of the President's agenda to build a strong economy. And where EDA really has its strength is its focus in regions. And that's where we're finding progress and innovation in regions. And this is a region that, I'll tell you, being from Northeast Ohio, this is a region that has fascinated me for quite some time in terms of the relationship between Ohio, Northern Kentucky, and Indiana. And to a great extent, it's looked upon, I'll share you a secret, a little bit jealously. Because we understand the northeastern part of Ohio being that manufacturing economy, and when things are good, they're good, and when things are difficult, they get really difficult. But we've always viewed this region as sort of a world in and of itself economically because of the relationship between Cincinnati, Hamilton County, Northern Kentucky, and Indiana. So to the extent that EDA is able to provide some assistance, both technical assistance and perhaps when appropriate financial assistance to regional initiatives, is something that you should very much consider. So without going through all of the investment programs that EDA has, there's 3 or 4 in particular that might be of interest. The Public Works Investment Program really provides resources for infrastructure. The Partnership Planning Investment Program support economic development districts, which is very much a part of what you're engaged in with your NPO here. University centers. This area is home to not only Xavier and University of Cincinnati, but other universities that are absolutely economic drivers and assets. There are resources available at the federal level that can help to facilitate the discussions and the relationships as it relates to moving the local economy forward. And then local technical assistance. So again, these are areas that aren't explicitly about transportation, but are explicitly about economic development. And because the two are so very tightly linked, it provides an opportunity to have a discussion with other federal agencies that may yield resources for what you're attempting to do here in terms of integrated transportation. EDA has great people, but it also, by virtue of its place in commerce, has access to very good data. Data that is not available in the private sector, and even some of it that it isn't necessarily affordable, depending on how you look at it. And as we talk about an environment of scarce resources, when you have good data and better data, and you make catalytic investments, which is what EDA is all about, it ultimately provides better outcomes. So again, talking about EDA as an agency that is able to hopefully navigate some of the gridlock, one of the things that I experienced leading up to the confirmation hearing is that there were both Democratic and Republican senators that represented urban areas and senators that represented rural areas that were very much in support of making these types of investments. And when you talk about a region of Northern Kentucky, Southwest Ohio, and parts of Indiana, you very much have representation that covers that entire spectrum, the urban areas of that region and the rural areas of the region. It also provides an opportunity to figure out a model that would work and be applicable to other communities across the country. And that's one of the other things that we've struggled with. And again, I can speak to Northeast Ohio, is that there has been oftentimes a struggle even getting regional cooperations amongst communities that are all within the same geographical footprint, let alone reaching across the board. Now, there has been some success in working with Western Pennsylvania and the Northeast Ohio region. But what you're doing here, based on my experience and my perspective, is something that is very much valued and would be a very great benefit to other regions across the country. I did have an opportunity in closing to digest and read the executive summary of the 2040 plan. And one of the things that I was very much impacted by was the level of public input, the level of outreach in these plans. Having been involved in a few of these plans, oftentimes public entities will go through the planning, and there is, in 99% of the cases, a required component of public interaction and public engagement. But too often, that public engagement is sort of taken as, well, we've got to do it, let's put it out there and get it done and say we can check that box. Well, it was obvious from reading the executive summary and getting into some of the data there that the level of engagement in this, that was put forward in this plan, is significant. And in any type of public engagement, you're not always going to get people who agree, whether it's the streetcar or where the investments are going in terms of populated or growing areas. But the fact that people were given the opportunity and then absolutely put forward the input into this plan was something that I think speaks volumes to the level of commitment here. I think it also speaks volumes to what I'll end with is the opportunity, the action, and optimism. The speakers this morning talked about it. This is a very difficult economic environment. The reality is that there isn't going to be, again, any new influx of significant funding that is going to solve our transportation integration issues anytime soon. But there is discussion. There are discussions going on, some of them not always reported in the news, between individuals on both sides of the aisle about how to make the investments where they are able to be leveraged and then can be used as models for other parts of the country. And that's what I will leave you with. What I think I'm most impressed by and most impacted with and would encourage you to continue to do is the level of collaboration that's evident here. And again, I say that, and I can go back and say I've seen that here, again, for 10 years. When I was just community development director, or coming into the community development direction in Northeast Ohio in Youngstown, and seeing the discussion, understanding the level of collaboration that was going on here, knowing that I'm sure from the outside it looks more rosy than it is. There are the fights, there are the turf wars, all those things happen here. But I can tell you that having been here now and having seen and heard and been a part of this discussion, I think that is a thing that will most well position you to be successful in terms of public funding, private funding. I heard, and I'll close with this, that I wasn't here, but I heard that yesterday or recently the mayor put forward a plan to seek a manufacturing designation, and I'm assuming it's the Investing in Manufacturing Communities Partnership that is being talked about. So those types of initiatives that really play on the strength of the region, the level of collaboration that has gone on, isn't as evident in other parts of the country, and that's unfortunate. And for those regions that figure that out and move forward in the way you are doing here, they will find themselves more successful. For those regions that continue to sort of resist that change and try to go in a more individual approach, which unfortunately too many of them still are, they're going to find themselves struggling. So again, thank you for allowing me to come down, and what I've heard and the experience has been very inspiring. And again, I'm an Ohioan, I'm a Buckeye, my roots are in Northeast Ohio, so I am a bit jealous of the success in a positive sense, but I think hopefully it will serve as an inspiration to another part of the state that is near and dear to my heart in terms of Northeast Ohio, and what we can and should be doing in terms of overall integration of transportation, rail, and other things, but also understanding the importance that it has to the economic development of this region and of this state. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jay, for those great comments. Are there any questions for Jay while we have him? Going once. Any questions? Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
Please, another round of applause. Thank you.